Welcome students. In this session we'll continue with the poem The Progress of Poesy by Thomas Gray. I've already introduced you the poet in my first session. Let's have a recap of the poem we have done so far. In The Progress of Poesy, a Pindaric ode, the subject and simile, as usual with Pindar, are united. So just in the way Pindar used to write poems, in the similar manner, Thomas Gray is dealing with the subject and use of simile in his poem. The various sources of poetry are described which gave life and luster to all it touches. So the sources of poetry are described in this poem, and it's poem that gives life and luster to human life. Gray illustrates its quite majestic progress, enriching every subject otherwise dry and barren. So it's a power of poem that enriches, which has its majestic progress, and whosoever this poem touches, the thing or the area or people, they lose their dryness and barrenness with a pomp of diction and luxuriant harmony of numbers. So poetry has its pomp of diction, the words, and luxuriant harmony and the melody and the music which is attached to it. And its more rapid and irresistible course when swollen and hurried away by the conflict of tumultuous passions. So these all things, the human emotions, the conflicts, the tumultuous aspect, it's not only just the gentler aspect. Poetry also deals with the anger, or which also deals with the tumult of human life. And we can see that poetry represents human life in its rapid, irresistible course. He also details power of harmony that calms the turbulent sallies of the soul and produces all the graces of emotion in the body. So with various pictures, with various similes, he details, Thomas Gray talks about the harmony which is associated with poetry, which has the power to calm even the turbulent minds, and it has the capacity to produce grace of motion in the body. So while giving examples from Venus, he invokes the graceful aspect of poetry. Now let's continue with the text. He says, in climes beyond the solar road, where shaggy forms over ice-built mountains roam, the muse has broke the twilight gloom to cheer the shivering native dull abode, and oft beneath the odorous shade of Chile's boundless forests laid. So in this stanza, when we come to 2.2, we see that here he's talking about the omnipresence aspect of poetry. So this aspect of poetry is not only present in the nearby geographical areas, rather he talks about the climates beyond the solar road. He talks about those remote regions, those remote chilly areas, that is Arctic regions, where even the sun does not reach. So beyond the solar road, where the sun light does not reach, there also poetry is present. And here he gives us the picture of shaggy forms, the people who are natives of this place, who wear furry things, over ice-built mountains roam, who roam about in the ice-built mountains, in the ice-covered areas. The muse has broke the twilight gloom. Muse here denotes poetry. All the gloominess, all the darkness, and all the cold aspect of this place is broken by the poetry. That means poetry has its special warmth in the minds of the people who roam here in these mountains. To cheer the shivering native dull abode. Without poetry, this place would have been absolutely dull and cold, and without any much of human population. But this poetry, in this gloomy and ice-covered area, somewhere this poetry helps to cheer up the shivering, the chill feeling of the people who live in these dull areas, and oft beneath the odorous shade of Chile's boundless forests laid. So here he says that not only in the snowy regions, but also in the shades, in the places which are full of trees, that is boundless forest, he talks about of Chile. He says that poetry is present everywhere, whether it's snowy areas or it's in the forest, wherever sun is not able to reach, poetry is present. She designs to hear the savage youth repeat in loose numbers, wildly sweet, their feather cinctured chiefs and dusky loves. So here he says that poetry is not present in these places with its proper formal format. Rather, poetry is also seen in these areas in a very savage form, because in the deep areas where there are people living in forest, you can see how poetry is formed in among them in a very loose numbers. So they are not this folk that we talk about, or these numbers. The numbers here means the music of the poetry which is there in these forest areas, or in the deep areas, or in these icy mountain areas. You can see that the poetry is not in that formal structure. Rather, the rhythm or the rhyme of the poetry is loosely connected, and though it's wild to listen, though it does not have that formal shape, but it has its sweetness in its wildness, in its coarseness. The feathered, cinctured chiefs and dusky loves. So this poetry is, or you can say songs in these tribal areas. They are there in the honor of the chiefs who wear feathered crowns, and the dusky love, and the dark mistresses. The people over here, they have a dark complexion, but they look beautiful even in their rough aspects. Her track, wherever the goddess roves, glory pursue, and generous shame. So here he says that wherever poetry is present, wherever this goddess roves, yeah, again he talks about, you can say, muse, or goddess of beauty, or goddess of art and literature. Wherever they are present, wherever poetry is present in its beautiful form, glory pursue. The fame is there, and generous shame. Generous shame means fear of losing reputation. So it's wherever poetry is, there is sacredness, there is glory which is associated with it, the unconquerable mind, and freedom's holy flame. Poetry represents unconquerable mind. Poetry represents freedom. And this sacredness of freedom, this sacredness of generosity, this sacredness of fame is always connected with poetry. Woods that wave over Delphi's steep, isles that crown the Aegean deep, fields that cool Elysius laves, or where meander amber waves in lingering labyrinths creep. So, students, here a poet talks about the source, or you can say the origin, or the journey of poetry from Greece. So, he says that poetry was first seen in the Delphi steep, that is the shrine of Apollo, that is god of poetry, somewhere associated with Greece. Isles, that island that crowned the Aegean deep. He says the poets that were associated with Aegean Sea, fields that cool Elysius laves. Now, Elysius is again a stream, a poetry, past Athens. So these places, they are all related to Greece, and he talks about that poetry, it started its journey from Greece. And there are a lot of poets who were associated or who were well known in these areas of Greece that he's talking just now, or where meander amber waves of lingering labyrinths creep. And here he also talks about meander, river meander, and its amber waves, the shining waves of or amber waves of this river, and lingering labyrinths creep. So this river that flows zigzag, or in the Asia Minor, here he is talking about that how poetry flowed in these areas, flowed in Greece in various forms, in various places. And there were very famous poets, Greek poets, that were associated to these places. How do your tuneful echoes languish, mute, but to the voice of anguish? But soon he says that these tuneful voice, this beauty of poetry, it soon faded away it, in this area, but to the voice of anguish, it became silent. Poetry became silent in Greece, and there was a lot of anguish, there was a lot of pain, there was a lot of sufferings in this area. So poetry became silent. Where each old poetic mountain inspiration breathe around. So the Greeks has its own time when all these poetic mountains, when those stalwarts, when those great famous poets, they used to inspire poetry. The poetry breathed around. There was an atmosphere of poetry in this area. Every shade and hallowed fountain murmur deep and solemn sound. So these were the blessed days of Greece, when each old poetic mountain inspiration breathed around. Every shade and hallowed fountain, he says, all these shady and sacred areas were the fountainheads of this solemn and deep sound of poetry. So everywhere in Greece one could hear the deep, the depth in the poems and the seriousness, as poetry originated, or you can say poetry first had its influence and inspiration from Greece itself. Till the sad nine in Greece evil are, left their Parnassus for the Latin plains. And here he's talking about the journey which poetry took when there was an evil hour, when there was this evil hour, you can say that when Greece was enslaved, these sad nine, the sad nine is again here reference to the nine goddess, that is muses of art and literature. They became sad when the Greece was in its evil hour, when it got enslaved, left their Parnassus for the Latin plains. So as we know that these nine muses, they live on Mount Parnassus. So they left this Greece and they took their journey to the Latin plains, that is to Italy. So how this shift of poetic center from Greece to Italy became, this journey is conveyed to your students through this poem. Alike they scorn the pomp of tyrant power. But when this poetry, it reached Italy, it did hate the pomp of tyrant power, because Italy was also governed by the tyrants, by the rulers, and they did not work to enrich this poetic aspect. The coward wise that revels in her chains. And this place, this Italy also is denoted as a place which is full of vice, and revels in her chains, where people, they took pleasures in being chained. And as you know that poetry always flourishes when people are free. Somewhere you see that he's saying that in Italy, poetry or the poetic writing was not given that amount of freedom, when Latinium had her lofty spirit lost. And soon this was the reason that Italy lost its lofty spirit, its grandness. They sought, O Albion, next thy sea enriched encircled coast. Soon poetry left this Italy also, and they searched and they found Albion. Albion is British Isles. So how this poetry had its journey from Greece to Italy, and then it reached British coast, or you can say British Island, next the sea encircled coast. So this was the seat of poetry after it left Italy. So we are going to continue with this poem in my next session. Thank you.